For those of you who are not familiar with Hasbara Fellowships Canada, we're the country's largest pro-Israel campus advocacy organization. Been around for about 18 years, active on about 30 campuses, high schools, universities, communities, etc. around the country. We engage, empower university students and beyond. And tonight's program was really a long time in the making. And I think one of the areas which is perhaps the least known, both among students and older, is exactly what constitutes Israel's legal rights. In other words, beyond divine providence, beyond what we know to be true intuitively, how do we know fundamentally that Israel didn't steal the land? How do we know, and how can we empower ourselves and the next generation to be able to communicate that Israel exists not because in 1948 European guilt over the Holocaust forced Polish Jews onto the native inhabitants of the Middle East, which is the common misconception and indeed the common narrative that's propagated today. So how do we know this? And I'll introduce Dr. Gauthier in a moment just so you fully understand the true gravity of his expertise this evening. And like I said, one of the reasons for tonight is that we're hearing a lot of high-level information. Dr. Gauthier has devoted his life to this. But I think that if we can sit through the presentation and try to identify one or two nuggets that we can take home with us, I think that's going to be tremendously powerful. And I think the message for us is not so much how do we take all this information in, but how do we take it and really synthesize it and be able to communicate it. Whether it's the next letter to the editor in a certain newspaper, where a writer puts in a letter that says Israel stole the land, whether it's to your kids on campus, and on and on and on. How do we synthesize one little slice of this and be able to communicate it? So I just want to go over very briefly a couple items that are available at the back table that I want to bring your attention to. One is actually, you'll see at the back wall there, there is a map of, it says Map of Palestine. So that's actually from 1948. You'll see on the back wall. That is from a, I believe, Rand McNally atlas. And this was actually used and taken by the nascent Israel Defense Forces in 1948 during the War of Independence, when they actually did not have any official military maps. And so what they did was they literally took a store-bought atlas and they used that as their military tool. And you can see it there. It is available for purchase, and we have a number of other magazines, Life magazines, from the 50th anniversary of Israel's defeat of its Arab neighbors, again there as well. Also a few housekeeping notes and a few forms there. The core training that Hasbara Fellowships does is we bring high-level student leaders to Israel for 18 days of front-level training. We bring them to the Gaza border, to the terror tunnels, to Hebron and Bethlehem and so on. And for many years people have been saying, we want to come. I wish this was around when I was a student. Well, lucky to be living at these times, because this coming summer we're introducing our first ever adult Israel advocacy training mission. It's a week long. It's just like our student program, but the food's better and the hotels are better. Information seats are very limited, so information is at the back table there. Two is, I want to bring your attention again, you may have seen this in the Toronto Sun and elsewhere, just to highlight in terms of what the students on campus are facing and why it's critical to educate ourselves and students in terms of what's going on. Some of you may have seen this, or one of our Hasbara Fellows, a student who participated in our training last month at U of T at the Monk School, sought advice on doing his doctoral studies. He emailed a professor by the name of Jens Hansen, and he asked, can I take you out for a coffee, pick your brain, ask you about doctoral studies, and didn't say anything about Israel or Jewish or anything. And Dr. Hansen responded with quite a paranoid screed that, among other things, said, you might be a student at the Monk School, but you're also a Hasbara Fellow, and therefore you're an Israeli government agent, and I refuse to meet with you on ethical and moral grounds. So when there's not a camera rolling, I'd be happy to share more information and what things have transpired since then. I know some of you have been involved in those developments, but you'll see some more information there. As well, one of the reasons we do these community events is we want this to be the beginning, not the end. And so I do encourage, as I said, at the back of the wall, there's a take action form. And here we have about a dozen different areas where you can be involved if you'd like, make phone calls, petitions, events, and so on and so forth. If you do want to be involved and use this as a springboard, then please do consider that. And then, of course, for those interested and allow us to continue the training, we do have sponsorship forms as well, and obviously that's always welcome. So, Dr. Jacques Gauthier has a bachelor's from Carleton University, as well as his law diploma from the University of Ottawa. He was admitted to the Ontario Bar in 1976, and his PhD from the Graduate Institute of International Studies at the University of Geneva in 2006. is the principal and founder of Gauthier and Associates, an international law firm established in Toronto in 1984. In 1989, he received the award for dedicated service to the profession from the Canadian Bar Association. Gauthier and Associates has a long-standing reputation for handling the national and international affairs, a wide range of commercial and successful entrepreneurial businesses. He's acted as legal counsel to a number of nations, including Spain, Mexico, and the Republic of France. In 2000, he was knighted by the Republic of France as Chevalier de l'Ordre de Mérite. I hope that's passable. And in 2015, he was knighted as Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur by the President of France. And even better, I would think. He served as acting chair and vice chair of the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development, and in 2009 led a human rights mission to China. His doctoral thesis, entitled Sovereignty over the Old City of Jerusalem, a study of the historical, religious, political, and legal aspects of the question of the Old City, was published 11 years ago. He's presented his findings of the competing claims to the Holy City under international law to numerous government officials, parliamentarians on many campuses and communities. He's made presentations in the Canadian Parliament, the British House of Commons, the House of Lords, the European Parliament in Brussels, the US Congress, the Italian Senate, the Dutch Parliament in The Hague, and the Japanese Parliament in Tokyo. He has also organized a number of international conferences. In 2012, he organized the Basel Conference on the recognition of the legal rights of the Jewish people in the State of Israel to the City of Jerusalem. And he also organized conferences in Geneva and Jerusalem, and most recently in San Remo last year. We have a copy, and I know he brought as well. This is a copy of his doctoral thesis, 1,100 pages. And I met him for the first time in December, and I said, I have this in my office. He said, have you read it? And I have read it since then. How much of it I understand, that's what I hope to learn this evening. But this is certainly a work of art, and I believe they are available for purchase. Is that correct? They could be available for purchase, so we'll communicate that if that is available as well. So without further ado, Dr. Gauthier.
Thank you very much. Really, it's an honor to be here. I've had interaction with this community for decades, and I know about this shul. It's the first time I speak at the Village Shul, and I really consider it a privilege. I want to make sure that you hear me. So those in the back, because I don't know how many times we'll have an opportunity to be together, but I'm here to explain certain things which are very crucial in the times that we live in. The issue of sovereignty over Jerusalem, the question of title in respect to the city of Jerusalem, is what I'm interested in. See, what's happened over the years is that the narrative of the Palestinians, of their allies, so quickly embraced and received by the nations, those in particular in the United Nations, has been recognized and accepted as well-founded in law. The argument is that some Jewish people, Israelis, in at least parts of Jerusalem, are usurpers, outlaws, trespassers, that they do not have the right to be there. As a lawyer, I have to underline the fact that if you're going to call someone a trespasser or a thief or a usurper, it's necessary to ascertain whether that person or the people are there pursuant to rights that have been given to them. If title has been given, if rights have been granted, then perhaps they're not thieves, they're not trespassers, they're not usurpers. So I decided, for different reasons, and I won't have time to go into those reasons tonight, to get to the bottom of this. In law, we call it a search for the root of title. Who was given rights, sovereign rights, in respect to the city of Jerusalem? And of course, I need to say that whatever I tell you about the status of Jerusalem tonight, there's a direct link to the entire area of the Holy Land, Judea and Samaria. So, the question, why have so many accepted the thesis that all of the rights under international law belong to the Palestinians? Well, here's part of the answer. You can't get to a legal conclusion unless you study the facts. And there are so many facts that are relevant here. In international law, to determine title and sovereignty, you have to look at defining moments of history, at events. And when there's a multiplicity of events that intersect each other, it's really, really difficult to come to the right conclusion. And it's easy to replace valid, well-founded legal arguments by political assertions. Are you with me?
Yeah.
If you don't really know the facts and are not familiar with the events, it's easy to lead you astray. One of the other problems which I've had to deal with, because I worked on this PhD thesis, I never planned to spend 20 years on the subject. But it's a puzzle that's got so many pieces to it. Like I don't know how many of you do puzzles, but think of a 10,000 piece puzzle. Before you can get an image, before you can figure out what you're after, it takes a while. And it took me a long time. My thesis director was extremely demanding and basically said to me, Jacques, if you're going to give me one page of this document that is not well supported, if you don't have backup for it, I'll reject it. Result? It took 20 years to do this instead of 10. Result, 3,200 footnotes. Result, I am regarded like an expert now because it's so heavy. Now, what I need to do is to connect the dots for you. And, your people are familiar with miracles. It takes a miracle to try to summarize so many relevant facts in a short time. But please pay attention. And when there's something of great significance, I'm going to highlight it. So, you have to understand that the question that I'm dealing with is one of territory. It's a territorial dispute under international law. In order to determine if the Jewish people have legal standing in Jerusalem and elsewhere, it is necessary to determine if someone or a group of people had title and gave it to the Jewish people. If I can't find that particular fact situation, if I can't present to you a moment in time when an entity or a group of entities got the rights and then in turn were able to give it to the Jewish people, then my analysis is flawed, my conclusions are not well-founded. So let's look at the key dots, and let's connect the dots. So I'll start with the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is a document that is probably, of all the facts, it's the declaration that is known worldwide, not only by Jewish people, but the average person may or may not have heard of it, but they realize that it's significant. So, let's look at this definition, this declaration. It's fascinating how often the rights and title of the Jewish people in respect to the Holy Land are based, according to some arguments, on the Balfour Declaration. But wait a minute, 1917. The Declaration is not the declaration of one man, it's not just Balfour, it's the entire war cabinet smack dab in the middle of the First World War, meeting with Lord George as Prime Minister. Balfour was in charge of foreign affairs. It's the cabinet that makes this decision to support a movement with a specific goal. But before I leave this declaration, let me stress this. In 1917, the British did not have possession of Jerusalem and most of the Holy Land. It's only in December that they actually entered Jerusalem. Furthermore, They didn't have possession. They didn't have title. This is Turkish territory. So here we have a nation, an empire, making a commitment to the Jewish people regarding a territory that they don't own and don't possess. Not a solid base for the conveyance of title. If we move on to the events that preceded the Balfour Declaration, this is very important. It's important in understanding the claim. If you go to court and you have a statement of claim, who's familiar with this expression, a statement of claim? That's how you start legal proceedings. You have a document, and that document sets out your claim. It's important for you to understand the claim that was presented at a very crucial moment of history by the Jewish people in respect to the Holy Land, in respect to Jerusalem. It begins with the thesis, the incredible publication of Herzl. Herzl, in The Jewish State, sets out what he believes is the solution to the problem of the Jews. The problem of the Jews. My studies have led me to the conclusion that this problem is the problem of the nations. The nations, for centuries, had major problems in addressing the broken, violated rights of a people, the Jewish people. And for a while, Herzl believed that the way to deal with it is to integrate properly in a particular society. And the less you fuss about things and you're a good German or good Austrian, then everything will be fine. But after the Dreyfus trial in Paris, when this officer in the French army was wrongly convicted and newspapers were full of anti-Semitic comments, he said, no, that's not the solution. The solution is a Jewish state. We need to have a place, a home, a national home, where we can have independence and we can take care of ourselves. That's what he proposes here. And a year after he publishes this, 1896, he organizes a conference. This is why I've organized conferences all over the place, including one in Basel, Switzerland for 3 days. And some of you who are here tonight were there at that conference. And he comes out and does the quasi-impossible. This is a miracle. He manages to assemble and unite about 200 Jewish people. That's a hard thing. It's not difficult for Jews to disagree with one another about just everything. He brings them together, and they adopt a program, the Basel program, which has a number of components, but the number one thing is a movement resulting in a national movement resulting in the creation of a home, of a state for the Jewish people. So that leads to the Balfour Declaration a number of years later. The Basel Conference is 1897. Jump forward to 1917. This movement, which is now led by Wiseman, is given recognition by the British. Wait a minute, the British, this is the British Empire. You may forget today that once upon a time, it was a vast, powerful empire. So to get the support of the British is no small thing. So when I said to you that legally it's not the source of the rights I'm interested in that I want to point to, that doesn't mean that the Balfour Declaration wasn't politically very, very helpful to the Zionist movement. It was. It's simply not the answer to the question that I've been asking. Where's the root of title? Where's the foundation? By the way, 1917, this is what Palestine looked like. It was subdivided in Sanjak. It was Turkish territory. On a map, there was no place called Palestine. Keep going. I'm going to come back to this now. So I told you that every so often, I'm going to highlight things which I never want you to forget. Please, This is my one opportunity to emphasize certain things which should make a big difference for the rest of your life when you deal with these issues. This map here is of tremendous significance. It's a map of the kingdom of David and Solomon. It's okay to show this map in a synagogue. I'm a jurist. I'm an international lawyer. And I'm telling you tonight, and I'm not going to qualify this, that this is an absolutely crucial map in understanding the legal rights of the Jewish people. I'm not here to in any way question what you might believe, your faith. That's all very significant, underlines so much of what's happening. But this is legally relevant. You're entitled to ask yourself the question right now, why would you say such a thing? A map? David, Solomon? Let's keep going. You'll see that in the days of the Balfour Declaration, the understanding when you referred to Palestine is that it was biblical lands. In French, this is a French map, La Terre Sainte. So when Palestine is used in the Balfour Declaration, that's what the British mean, the Holy Land. We'll keep going. I take you now to the Paris Peace Conference. Talk about cornerstones. The war is over. The British have defeated the Turks, they defeated the Germans, their allies, and they gather for 6 months in Paris. Where do they gather? At the Quai d'Orsay. If you've been to Paris, and this place is, I should update the date because it's still looking like this. They met in that building for 6 months in 1919. From January 1919 to mid-1919, the Allies meet at the Quai d'Orsay in order to deal with the consequences of the war, and these are very difficult times for the defeated nations, because in many situations, the result is the taking away of large chunks of their territories. Keep going. The other term I never want you to forget, because if you miss this, the puzzle won't come together. The Supreme Council of the Allies. If you understand who they are and the rights that they get, then you have you're getting closer to the answer as to how title ended up with the Jewish people. Why are they so important? In this picture, you've got 4 nations represented, and there were 5 principal powers. There was France, Britain, the United States, Italy, and Japan. What did you forget? Japan, First World War, they were on the right side. Sneak preview. I guess sometimes you say spoiler alert. They were involved in the decision that gave the rights to the Jewish people, which I'm going to tell you about. So I went to Tokyo and spoke in front of the parliament in Tokyo and told them, do you realize you were involved in giving the rights to the Jewish people to the Holy Land? You know, big eyes. And then I had to show them pictures of the Japanese delegation at the right time for them to comprehend the role that they played. So the key moments at the peace conference for us, for the discussion that we're having tonight, is February 6th, 1919, and February 27th. February 27th should be in every school book in every Jewish school, given the importance of what happened there. Let's go on. Here we are, February 6th. That's when the Arabs present their case, because you know the story of Lawrence of Arabia. Some Arabs supported the British during the war against the Turks. The British wanted to reward them. So they come and ask for legal standing, first of all, as a people, the Arab people. Never forget, the parties. Who are the parties? in respect to the Ottoman territory. On one side there are the Arabs, on the other side the Jews. The Arabs asked for independence in large chunks of the Ottoman territories, and you'll see where that leads. Regarding Palestine, they declare in front of, let's go back, in front of the nations I've referred to. So you see who's there on behalf of the Arabs. They're led by Faisal, and Lawrence of Arabia is there. I don't know if you can read this. Who's listening to them? It's like a court of appeal. There are other allies, but the ones, the most powerful ones, who make the decisions, US, British, France, Italy, and Japan. And in front of them they say, regarding Palestine, we're not asking for an independent Arab state there. They had, through Faisal, discussed agreements and arrangements with the Zionist leaders. There's an agreement in January of 1919 where Weizmann and Faisal agree that there's going to be Arab states and Palestine under Jewish control. That's in the agreement. So they don't ask for title to Palestine during this meeting, but they ask for huge chunks of the territories. Next, February 27th. That date is so important that I'm going to organize a conference sometime in the future in Paris to focus on this on this day. That's when the Zionist leadership presents the case. So, as a jurist, it's like the moment where you go to court and you present your claim. You say, this is what we want to the judges. Who are the judges? The leaders of those 5 nations, led by Weizmann. Sokolow played a very key role. And all sorts of things happen. I don't have time to get into that now, but this is when the claim is presented. Next. What do they want? They want the recognition of the right to reconstitute a home. Not constitute. Please note. To reconstitute what once was there. And they want recognition of the historic title of the Jewish people to Palestine. It is so disturbing to see group after group after group trying to revisit this and present again the request for recognition of the title, the historic title to the land, when it was already presented. There's only one important question for you to ask now. All right, February 27, it was presented. What was the response of the Supreme Council? Not yet. They want a particular chunk of territory. And they present biblical maps, and they basically want as much of the Holy Land as will cover everything that was of great significance historically and biblically. And then they ask for something else. They do want sovereignty and title. This is what it's all about. But they say, we're not ready. Because in those days, there were about 70,000, 80,000 Jewish people in Palestine, and about 800,000 Arabs. So they didn't want that to happen then. They wanted an opportunity to bring Jewish people from all over the world until there was a majority. Then the state would be constituted. In the meantime, there would be a guardian, a trustee, a mandatory. They asked for protection while it's like the child in the womb grew to the point where that child could be born. Very intelligent strategy. So, what happens next? I'm showing you the maps. On the left is the map presented by the Zionist organization, by the leaders, during that February 27th presentation. And you'll see how, if you look at the Holy Land divided among the 12 tribes, almost everything that's relevant is covered by what they're proposing. Next. Now, during the Paris Peace Conference, this is another cornerstone of the argument. Legally, absolutely crucial to understand the relevance of the covenant of the League of Nations. So what happens? It's a document. You know, the word covenant is interesting because I believe that those of you who are biblical scholars are familiar with a whole number of covenants between the Almighty and the Jewish people. It's interesting that this document is entitled the Covenant of the League of Nations. In this covenant, which is approved by, here we go again, the Supreme Council, it's those 5 nations that make all the crucial decisions. That's why I don't want you to forget those 5 nations. April 28, 1919, it's adopted. Wilson was really one of the key architects. Smuts was really crucial, and he played a very key role in the adoption of this document, which took the world in a new direction. Because in the old days, if you had a war and you defeated the other guy, guess what? You just took the territory. But according to this new approach, many of the territories, not all the territories, but many of the territories that belong to the defeated nations were put under an international trust called international mandates. Article 22 is of tremendous significance in the covenant, because that's where there's a reference to the establishment of these mandates over certain territories where the people are not quite ready to have independence, to have a nation. And the task, the responsibility, the function, the mandate given to the supervising nation is referred to as a sacred trust of civilization. I contend today that one of the beneficiaries of such a sacred trust was the Jewish people, and that the nations have contravened the rights of the Jewish people in regard to the territory that was promised to them. Next, I want to show you the principle that is the key piece of the puzzle without which you can't get to the right conclusion legally. The British and their allies, the Supreme Council, when they defeated the Germans, imposed severe terms on the Germans, including the taking away of territory. Who got title to those territories? The principal powers. Next. Here's another example. Treaty of Trianon. This time, we're talking about the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. They were defeated. They lost territory. Who got title? Again, the principal powers got the title. Next. Now I take you to Saint Remo. So, I really want your attention now. Remember on February 27th, there was a presentation made by the leaders of the Zionist delegation to the 5 powers. During that presentation, the claims were presented. They asked to recognize our historic title. Give us and grant us the rights necessary to reconstitute what we used to have, and so on and so forth. Question: how did the principal powers respond to these submissions to that presentation? In Paris, for the 6 months, they were so busy with the Germans and the Austrians and the others that they discontinued their meetings in Paris in June of 1919 and reconvened the peace conference in this place in Saint Remo, the Villa de Vachon. So what happens is that for several days in April of 1920, they deliberate. They address the issues. They consider what to do in response to what was presented by the Arabs on February 6, 1919. They're like judges in a chamber. They heard all the presentations. They're looking at the claims, and they're saying, what are we going to do? Who was there? Here we go. It's the Supreme Council, of course. And you know, a number of years ago, I had the privilege of spending time in the villa. I was there with my wife, Rani, and my daughter, Shaloma, and they're here with me tonight. We have a number of daughters, but you know, I've said this often. If you're going to undertake something like this, you better make sure you have the support of your spouse. And in my case, I would have quit over those 20 years so often, but for the support of my wife, my daughters. Again, Rani, thank you. Shaloma, thank you. My other daughters have other commitments. They're often with us in conferences, wherever we go. But without them, this would never have been completed. So, we go there. And while we're in this villa, I was invited for tea by a lady who she was an old lady in her 80s. And she said, I have something, I've heard about you, and I have something for you. She had an envelope filled with pictures, which she shared with me, which enables me now, when I talk about the significance of the conference in San Remo, to show you some pictures. Evidence. I'm not making this up. This happened. What happened here? Italy, Nitti chaired the meeting, the Prime Minister. Lord George, who led Britain during the war, is there. Curzon, by then he was the Foreign Affairs Minister. Mitterrand, President of France, was there. The ambassador of the US is there, sadly, one of the very key actors on the scene in the war, by then has had a stroke, and that's Wilson. So he couldn't attend this meeting. And here they are, standing on the steps, and we've stood on these steps now on a number of occasions, and some of you who are here have been there. The villa is still there. It's now a luxury condo. You can rent or buy apartments there. And here we are, the leaders. What did they decide? Here's the key resolution. They take the principles of the Balfour Declaration, the very declaration which I told you by itself could not be the source of the rights given to the Arabs, the right given to the Jews. Why? Because the British didn't have title, they didn't have possession, but all of a sudden, we've got the 5 powers. All I need to do now is to connect one more dot that's crucial, and is to show you that these powers got title from the Turks. Then, you should really pay attention to what they're deciding on this day, April 25, 1920. And there are some in this room, I'm thinking about you, Richard Bass, who have done so much over the last years, understanding the significance of this day, to present that throughout the United States, school systems, and now more and more people know about this. So they basically take the Balfour Declaration policy about creating a national home for the Jewish people, giving the political sovereignty rights to the Jewish people, subject to respecting the civil and religious rights of the other inhabitants, without even referring to the Arabs, anybody else there. Next. This meeting on April 20, these meetings, April 24, 25, addressed the question, but if we're going to give them rights to Palestine, if we're going to give them the right to reconstitute what they used to have, what is the territory? So Lord George, who is a devoted Christian scholar, said, well, I know the most famous book of archaeology and that to study the Middle East is from George Adam Smith. And map 34 tells us exactly what Palestine should be. He says it should be from Dan to Beersheba. So the French guy said, all right, what does that mean? Land of Beersheba. Scripture, many, many times in the Hebrew scriptures, that expression appears from Dan. It's from the north to the south. So that map is used during the meeting as the basis for the determination of the territory where the rights of the Jewish people are going to be recognized. Remember I told you at the outset that this map was crucial? Next. Sometimes I present this around the world. I present it to government officials in Israel. I present it to in synagogues, and I worry that you might think that I'm exaggerating the significance of what's happened in San Remo. But what about this? This is Wiseman. He says, the San Remo decision has come, that recognition of our rights in Palestine is embodied in the treaty with Turkey. We'll talk about the Treaty of Sevres. And has become part of international law. It's the most momentous political event in the whole history of our movement, the Zionist movement, and perhaps no exaggeration to say in the whole history of our people since the exile. Did I really exaggerate? That's Wiseman. The whole history of the Jewish people since the exile? This is the key moment? And I go around and I'm not Jewish and I'm telling the Jewish people, this is really, really important. You know. And when I started that, my first presentation ever was in 2007 in a synagogue in this city, before I started to make presentations all over the world. Can you imagine the courage, the trust that these rabbis had in inviting me, not knowing anything really about me or my work? And that was the beginning. And now I've been speaking all over the place, but still just scratching the surface in many ways. Certain things have happened over the last months, which I'm going to tell you about before I conclude, which are really, really crucial. The Treaty of Sevres was signed with the Turks a few months later, August 1920. You'll note who the signatories are for the Allies. 4 out of 5 nations that I mentioned to you. The United States never declared war against Turkey, so it's not a party to this treaty. But it takes the words of the Balfour Declaration, the policy, and it's right there in the treaty. This is an international convention, and the rights of the Jewish people are enshrined. They're codified. They're right there. And now, I wish there was a drummer in here, and there could be a drum roll. Look at that, Article 132. What does Turkey do? If you can't see this, you got to stand and see this. It's unbelievable. Turkey gives all the rights to the principal allies. This is it. They own the lands, the territories. From 1517 to 400 years later, they were the title holders. They had sovereignty. And in the midst of a peace negotiation, they give title to the principal powers. And what do the principal powers do in San Remo? They give Palestine to the Jews. They give Iraq or Mesopotamia to the Arabs. They give Syria to the Arabs. They give Lebanon to the Arabs. We'll see what that does. Keep going. The mandate for Palestine. Then, there's a mandate, which is a treaty that is prepared, again, to articulate and define and explain the rights given to the Jewish people. I forget the exact number, but Jewish people are referred to in the mandate for Palestine something like 30 times. Maybe not exactly, but close. And then there's almost no reference to the Arabs at all. The mandate for Palestine is all about the Jewish people and what was decided in St. Remo. Palestine is for the Jews. Now, what's interesting is that the initial draft of the Palestine Mandate starts with stressing that in the Treaty of Sevres of August 1920, Turkey renounced in favor of the principal Allied powers all rights and title over Palestine. Is that succinct enough? No need to go to law school. It's right there. Turkey gave the rights to the powers. And in the mandate relating to Palestine, the powers give it to the Jewish people. Let's keep going. Now, I've just highlighted what I've just told you. Next. I just want to tell you that there were 3 mandate instruments that came out of the deliberations in San Remo. One for the Jews, one was the mandate for Mesopotamia, and the other one was the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. When you look at the key articles of these documents, it's clear that 2 of them, it's the inhabitants that are the beneficiaries of the legal rights, but not for the mandate for Palestine. So, the original, I'm not going to, Article 25, the original article was changed. The original one dealt with different issues, and then it was changed in a way that was very detrimental to the Jews. We'll get to that. Here's the key article of the mandate for Palestine. Here we're pillar of my argument. In Article 2, the rights are given for the creation, the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. But further, it is specified that it's to be done as laid out in the preamble of the mandate. What does the preamble say? You will see that the key provisions of the preamble include the recognition of the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the right to reconstitute their national home. Remember what they asked for in Paris? Precisely what they asked for was granted. So as a lawyer, I say, this is chose jugée. In Latin, res judicata. Those with the right to make the decisions judicially made the decision. They said yes to the Jewish people. We recognize your historical connection with the land. It's done. Fait accompli. What on earth is the General Assembly doing? Passing one resolution after another. What abominable conduct! What incredible double standard! What happened to their memory? What happened to the truth? To these historical truths? Next. It took me forever to find the mandate for Palestine. I wanted to find an original version. You can find in many different settings on the internet the terms of the mandate for Palestine. It'll take you 3 minutes. I couldn't find a copy that was signed anywhere. Years and years and years of research. Couldn't find it. So I thought, well, one place that could have it is the archives, the main national archives in London. British mandate, good place to look. The head of the archives, a lady that's been around for a long, long time, knows everything, was pulling her hair out. She couldn't find it. And she eventually said, I'm sorry, we can't find an original of the mandate for Palestine in the archives. So I was a little despondent because it didn't make sense. Out of nowhere, a few months later, we heard from her, and she said, I've been looking ever since, and I found it. There was a book, and on the book there was a label, and that's a copy of the label. It was the British mandates in East Africa, Togoland, Cameroon, and tucked under Togoland, Cameroon, and East Africa was the mandate for Palestine. What on earth was it doing there? So next, you'll see, this is the original. I found it. This is the Magna Carta of the Jewish people. This codifying, reflecting the decisions made in April of 1920 by the Allies in San Remo. And the result of that document was this. You see the mandate for Palestine covered both sides of Palestine, east and west of the Jordan River, Iraq to the Arabs, Syria to the French in Lebanon. This is in March of 1921, not long after the decisions of San Remo and the drafting of the mandate. There's a real kerfuffle between the French and the Arabs. Faisal tried to declare himself king. The French are upset. They send their troops over. The Arabs are ready to rebel and to start another war. And Churchill is now the Secretary of State, or the Foreign Minister. And he convenes a conference in Cairo, and to appease the Arabs, decides to give the entirety of Palestine east, everything east of the Jordan River, to the Hashemites. And as a result, the area granted to the Jewish people under the mandate shrinks tremendously. But back to this memorandum. In a memorandum submitted to the Council of the League of Nations in September 1922, the British promised to honor the rights granted to the Jewish people in the rest of Palestine. And that's a commitment that's still relevant today. I could spend an hour on that. Furthermore, if you keep going, if you have any doubt, what was given to the Arabs was Palestine. That comes out of Article 25. It was part of Palestine. Next, Article 15. Certain rights were to be protected in the area given to the Hashemites. No discrimination, basis of race, religion, and language. Guess what happened after they got the rights? What happened there, as a human rights advocate, is so incredibly appalling. The minute the Hashemites got control of East Palestine, the Jews lost all their rights. They couldn't even live there. They couldn't have settlements there anymore. No Jews allowed. It's relevant today, because the proposition of the nations today is that we're going to create the state of Palestine, covering the West Bank, as they call it, Gaza, and Jews are not allowed to remain there. No more settlements, no more communities. We want it to be just like what happened in what was Transjordan and became Jordan. And the world just fails to react. It makes no sense. And what is Israel right now? If a citizen who's an Arabic citizen has one tiny little right that's disregarded, it's right to the Supreme Court. You don't even, like in Monopoly, you just go, Supreme Court. Of course, all of their rights are to be honored and respected. But in the new Palestinian state that is being discussed, Jews have no rights at all. They can't even live there. I thought I read to you the fact that the historical connection was recognized to that land. It's in the documents. It's in the treaties. It's in the resolution. I showed you the map, which is the basis of the decision in San Remo, Kingdom of David and Solomon. And whenever the French argued with the British as to where the boundary should be between Lebanon and Palestine, the French kept saying, "You're going too far north. It's beyond Dan." Isn't that interesting? The French were saying, "We agreed to Dan to Beersheba." And the British were trying to go further up. The French relied on map 34. Everybody relied on map 34. Judea and Samaria are smack dab in the center of it. Recently, with my wife and 3 of our daughters, we went to Shiloh. What a place. Imagine. That's where the tabernacle was for 400 years. that's where the mother of Samuel came and prayed to God to have a child. This is historically. Remember, Joshua came and he had his battles in Jericho, beat up a whole bunch of Canaanite kings, then went up the Jordan Valley, made a left turn towards what is now Nablus. Shechem. Sorry for the pronunciation. So we went up to Mount Gerizim. We went on top of Mount Gerizim. You have any idea how many Jewish people ever go there? I was told it's less than 1%. Nobody goes there. But this, historically, look at the connection. Then we look down.
I was there.
We look down from Mount Gerizim, and what do we see? We see Nablus, and in the middle of it is a little dome. Tomb of Joseph. But you can't barely go there because Jews are not welcome. Unless you have a platoon of soldiers to protect you. Then not too far away, go up, turn left, tomb of Joshua. I understand it's hard to find the tomb of Moses. But this is where Joshua was supposed to be buried. 3 times a year, some bold, courageous Jewish people with the army go and pray there. 3 times a year. What happened to the historical connection that was recognized by the principal powers? What nonsense is this? We went to visit the tomb of Samuel. A beautiful view of Jerusalem from there. That's not too far from Jerusalem. Many of you perhaps have seen that. But again, it's in Area C, and a lot of our friends from Tel Aviv and elsewhere would say, how could you went over there? But of course we did. And every Jewish person, every Israeli should be comfortable being there. We're going to move forward. Next is, we'll go further. These are the rights that should be respected. Here's a map of the League of Nations. Very interesting. After the partition of Palestine, right over here, look, next slide. Here's what it says. An Arab state is created by the nations after the partition of 1921 in Palestine. The Arabs already have a state in Palestine. This is what the map says. Next. That's what happened after the partition. And next. Treaty of Lausanne. Because the Treaty of Sèvres was signed, and yet the Turks didn't ratify it, eventually another treaty was signed with the Turks in June of 1923. Important document. It didn't change anything. Everything I've said thus far remained exactly as it was. Next. The UN Charter. Before the UN was created, the League of Nations dissolved. It couldn't survive the war, the First World War. The key allies, remember Japan and Italy were key allies during the First World War. They became enemies during this war. And this is important. Even though the League has been dissolved, the mandated territories were supposed to be administered for the well-being and development of the people who had received the rights previously. The UN has no greater rights than the League of Nations. It can supervise, it can't change what was given to the Jewish people. In case you think that's my opinion, let me refer you to an article right in the UN Charter. Article 80 says specifically nothing in the Charter of the UN shall be construed in any manner to take away rights of any peoples prior to the Charter. This article was the result of negotiations with some Jewish people in San Francisco. It was meant to protect everything that was given to the Jews before. Next. UN partition resolution, I'll say this. I can't believe how many misunderstand the partition resolution of 1947. They think that that was the foundation of the Jewish state. No, it's a General Assembly recommendation. In the charter it says very clearly, and no lawyer will disagree with me, that no General Assembly resolution can be binding on the nations. Only certain Security Council resolutions. In the partition resolution, by the way, there was a clause that set aside Jerusalem to create a special international zone, and there was supposed to be a referendum after 10 years. There was already a significant Jewish majority in Jerusalem. So Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, they all write the same thing. That was okay with us. In 10 years we'll have even more Jews there. We'll win the referendum. So the reference to Jerusalem was acceptable. Well, you know what happened to the partition resolution? There was a recommendation. The Jews said, okay, they were desperate. Under duress. They had been through such calamities. Imagine what the Jewish people had gone through. It was difficult for them to negotiate properly after what they'd gone through in respect to the Holocaust, as a result of the Holocaust. But they said yes. The Arabs said no. Anyway, we get to another key dot, final dot, the birth of Israel. Now, just before we get to that, on May 14, 1948, the British left the mandated territory of Palestine. It's very interesting how many times I discuss the birthday of the State of Israel with my friends, and I'm told that, yeah, May 14, such a crucial. Israel was not born, if you use not the Jewish calendar, but the normal calendar that people like to use from day to day. Israel was not born on May 14. It was born on May 15. Because if you read the Declaration of Independence, it says specifically, effective midnight. When Ben-Gurion is reading the Declaration in Tel Aviv, you've seen the pictures, he says effective midnight. The Palestinians know the birthday of Israel. When do they celebrate what they call the Nakba? What day? 15. May 15. They know. So, in the Declaration of Independence, I just wish I was there to advise Ben-Gurion and his team, because they barely refer, they don't mention St. Remo. They refer to the partition resolution, but I guess it's been so long, the nations were not supportive of it very much. That was a Zionist undertaking, an initiative, so he refers to that. But the summary of how Israel supports its declaration is very, very flawed. But nevertheless, they did declare, and it became a state as of the 15th of May. And there are other things that I could deal with to prove to you that the mandate obligations of the nations are still relevant today. It's too late to get into that. Keep going. And now, quickly. Jerusalem is often referred to as a city divided by the Green Line, and the nations have adopted these General Assembly resolutions and even some Security Council resolutions, which take the position that everything beyond the Green Line doesn't belong to Israel. What is the Green Line? This you have to remember. It was an armistice agreement between Israel and Jordan at the end of the War of Independence, and this is the date of the agreement, and it says very clearly, no provision in this agreement shall prejudice the rights and claims and positions of the other. It's just a military demarcation. They're saying, you stay here, we stay there, we don't go any further, nothing to do with the question of sovereignty or title. Next. So, what are the nations saying today? You've got the boundaries of Jerusalem, the old boundaries, the new boundaries. They're saying everything on the other side of the Green Line is supposed to be the new capital of the Palestinian state. And I go around the world and say, wait a minute, do you mean to say that the entirety of the old city of Jerusalem, is going to be part of the capital of the Palestinian state? Most of the time people don't realize what they're doing. And this green line thing, it's got this sacredness to it. And people have forgotten that they're simply armistice lines that go back to 49. Next. Here's what happens if you divide the land or the city that way. The light blue is what's left of Jerusalem for Israel. The dark green is the new capital of the Palestinian state. The light green is the adjacent Palestinian state. You see that what's left of Jerusalem is completely surrounded by a Palestinian state. Makes no sense. Well, incidentally, that includes all of the Jewish cemeteries on the Mount of Olives, 100,000 graves. You know what happened the last time the Jordanians took possession of those areas. They desecrated and destroyed the synagogues. They destroyed everything that had a Jewish connotation to it. How many, I have a question for you. Maybe, Richard, you could correct me if I'm wrong. How many UN resolutions condemn the Jordanians for what they did in 1949? How many? Absolutely disgusting behavior of the nations. And yet in 1967, when Israel takes over eastern parts of Jerusalem, immediately the resolutions appear month after month, year after year. I think we're now up to 200 or 300 resolutions, the General Assembly condemning Israel for what it's doing in Jerusalem. We know the old city, but I want to point this out next. Jerusalem, for thousands of years, was essentially the old city. That's the first century. Next slide. Here's the new Roman city, which is very close to the old city today. Next. Crusader Jerusalem. Look, it's the old city. Next. Here's a late 19th century map. And what's important about this is that there's almost nothing outside the walls. So why am I underlining this? Because in the minds of those who want Jerusalem, the real Jerusalem is what was there almost 2,000 years, the old city. It's the ultimate bone of contention. And if you offer the Palestinians a little chunk of a neighborhood of Jerusalem, they'll never accept that. They want this. Next. The security, this is an example of a Security Council resolution which basically takes the position that Israel has no rights in Jerusalem, part of Jerusalem. Next. I'm going to conclude with this. You know, one of my big problems over the years is no matter how many times I presented this, the question would be asked, well, these are pretty solid arguments. We think you've got something very important here, but why is it that the government of Israel is not presenting these arguments? In 2012, we organized a conference in Jerusalem. I invited government officials to come. The mayor came, but very few officials came. 2013, I was invited to speak to a whole gathering of lawyers in the Department of Justice. They were attentive. But I didn't know if it made a difference what I said. Now, in November of 2017, just a few months ago, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department dealing with Jerusalem and Heritage Affairs of Israel, and the Department of Justice, 3 departments organized a conference and gave me half the day to present. And right now I'm being told that their arguments going forward, they're no longer going to accept the Palestinian narrative. They are going to assert their legal rights based on That's yours truly at the conference. And the minister of Elkin who spoke so strongly about presenting these rights from now on. And the deputy foreign minister who was there as well. And this guy's brilliant. He's the chief legal advisor for foreign affairs, and he was there. So all of a sudden, it took so long, Richard, Barry, it took so long, and for those who followed my adventures around the world, but finally, Israel is going to stand and say, wait a minute, Jerusalem, it's ours. We're not usurpers, we're not thieves, we're not trespassers. We're here as of right. Thank you. About 10 minutes of questions. Yes.
I'm often astounded by our Prime Minister, who professes to be such a stalwart defender of human rights, who so cavalierly dismisses our rights and our, I think, obviously, as you've noted, our legitimate claims to anything that the Arabs claim are theirs. His silence is deafening. Do you have any explanation? You've met, I'm sure, with Canadian officials. He always says the settlements are illegal. You know, any kind of claim the Israelis make are ill-founded. He never has had the decency to substantiate his assertions. But then you have the press who've never pressed him on it. Do you have any explanation for that?
Well, that's more of a political question than a legal question. But let's say this. A few moments ago I told you that it's taken a long time for Israel to put the pieces of the puzzle together and to acknowledge their entitlements under international law. You know, many Israelis and many Jews around the world have no difficulty explaining why the land should be theirs from a scriptural point of view, because of the promises of the Almighty. But very few are able to explain this from a legal perspective. And that's starting to happen with the government of Israel, which is encouraging. But I had the privilege of traveling to Israel for a whole week with Prime Minister Harper in 2014. And he was a great friend of Israel, and he understood a lot. Nevertheless, and we knew each other, he had the thesis, he would still say that whatever the legal arguments are, ultimately it's up to the Israelis and the Palestinians to come up with a solution, a plan. And I can't, no matter how strong my legal arguments are, law by itself is insufficient. Politics is still relevant. The only thing I say to Palestinians and to others is never go into a negotiating room, sit at a table, and claim or take the position that the Jews are not in Jerusalem as of right. They have the rights. What they choose to do with those rights is up to them. I have my opinion as to what they should do. But back to Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, there's no doubt that his inclinations are not similar to the previous Prime Minister. He has not visited Israel. He's not been invited to visit Israel. So you need to pray for him.
Thank you.
Yes.
Your presentation is amazing. I want to say I am a follower of the politics in Israel for many, many years, and I want you to know you touched my heart. It was an amazing presentation. And I want to point out one thing. With all the rights that you say the Jews have, if they hadn't won in 48, it would be worth Gornish.
How can I dispute that? Yes.
I want your comment about the December 2016 Security Council resolution that you had up there, which was Obama's parting shot at Israel and at Netanyahu. How significant a problem is that going to be for Israel?
Well, I often stress the fact that I don't care how many General Assembly resolutions are passed, they're not binding in international law. You should know that certain Security Council resolutions are binding and others are not. That one is not under the heading which makes it a binding resolution. However, it is still a Security Council resolution, and I can assure you that constantly the Palestinians are walking around with their copy of that resolution saying, the UN has decided that the Israeli presence in East Jerusalem is in violation of international law. So they keep repeating that and repeating that and repeating that. It is helpful, if you look at the dynamics of the situation, it is helpful that they have won from the Security Council. It was an absolutely horrible thing that Obama did to Israel and to the Prime Minister. Yet, interestingly, the recent initiatives of the current American president have really, really impacted the question of Jerusalem. I can tell you that after I finished my presentation in November in Jerusalem, there was a lineup of people who wanted to talk to me, one of whom was the ambassador of one of the African states. And he said to me, he waited 15 minutes to talk to me, and he said, every month I organize a gathering of African ambassadors in Tel Aviv. That's where their embassies are. Would you come to speak to us? Because we're asking a lot of questions about Jerusalem and what we should do. So Trump is like an icebreaker. Some people call him a wrecking ball. But it's really, you've heard that the Czechs are now planning to move their embassy, that Romania is talking about it, a couple of Latin American countries. So a lot of nations, Jerusalem is a very nice place to live. And I believe that that's going to change the landscape from the perspective of diplomacy and politics. But it's never been more crucial to underline the rights under international law of the Jewish people to Jerusalem, to Judea and Samaria.
So we're having some trouble just following one of the concepts you're talking about. Weizmann and his group were Zionists, and the map that you use is biblical Jewish, like a Jewish biblical map. The claim that the Israelis that you speak of, is it a Jewish claim in the land, or is it a Zionist handover by the League of Nations? It's like, so if they're going to hate us for being Zionists, they're going to hate us for being Jewish. Who has the claim?
Once upon a time.
Do you understand my question?
Yeah, but once upon a time, you've been very much detrimentally affected by what you've read over the last decade or two. Once upon a time, the term Zionist wasn't frowned upon, was an accepted way of describing the aspirations of the Jewish people for their land. The Balfour Declaration, signed by Arthur Balfour, Declaration of the Cabinet, was sent to the president of the Zionist Federation of England, Rothschild. the Zionists, the conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897 was a Zionist Congress. It was the birthplace of the plan. So it's the anti-Semitic media that has gradually, with the support of so many nations in the General Assembly of the UN, that has created all these negative connotations.
Sure, but the claim was given to Zionists, not to a group of, not to rabbis, not to Jewish people to have the whole, the old city, but to Zionists, to create a nation at the time of nation building, no?
The Zionist delegation spoke for the Jewish people worldwide. They were spokesmen. They were the advocates of the world Jews. That's how they were viewed. And when the rights were given in San Remo, they weren't given to the Jews of Palestine. They were given to the 14 million Jews worldwide. Yes, Madame.
So would it be possible for the Jewish people to perhaps sue the UN for not following up on the League of Nations mandate?
Okay, so that is an interesting question. I'm asked that question all the time. Where can we present your arguments? And so my first response is, forget the International Court of Justice. Because it is not a court of justice, it's a political kangaroo court. The appointees, the judges, most of whom are politically answering to their sovereigns. It's not a true court of justice. You can't go there. So where do you go? If you want to sue them, you could sue them in a court in Canada or in a court in the US. But it's like Russian roulette. Depends on the judge or judges that you get. And so it's a real challenge. The truth is, the rights are there, but in a world that is not entirely sympathetic with the aspirations of Israel and the Jewish people,
Entirely.
it's hard to find the right setting. Yes?
Dr. Gauthier, in your esteemed judgment, what effect do you expect that David Friedman instructed the State Department to not call the territories Gaza, Judea, Samaria, Golan Heights, not to call them occupied territories? What effect will that have on the world opinion?
Limited effect. He's an American ambassador. He is close to President Trump, who's obviously a very good friend of Israel. So sadly, the European Union, for instance, many of the countries there are very, very supportive of the Palestinian cause. And so it's good. I'm glad he took that position, but do I think it's really going to make a big difference? No. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to me that it took a non-Jewish international lawyer like yourself to help us Jews assert our rights. Do you think there's something wrong with the way we Jews think about this, which some Jews, even in Israel, consider that we have a galut mentality, as if we have to exit even from Israel? We're almost as if the Palestinians are the Jews and they're the underdogs. But it's hard for us Jews to assert ourselves the way you're indicating that we should.
Well, the truth is, if you had done the work and your thesis was 20 pounds and not 10 pounds, still many of the places I go would not welcome you. They would react as follows. They would think, your conclusions can't possibly be valid and legitimate because you're biased.
Right.
So it puts a tremendous responsibility on my shoulders, because I realize that I have a time frame when I can perhaps share these historical truths and conclusions, legal conclusions, with as many as possible while the dish is still in the oven. Things have not crystallized, things are happening. So, which is not to suggest, I mean, let's not forget Wiseman, how he was so skilled as a diplomat, so brilliant. He is an amazing human being. Without him, I don't know what would have happened in 1917 and thereafter. And without Herzl. So the architects of the modern Jewish state, under divine guidance, were incredibly Jewish and brilliant. Okay, so they had Christian friends. Balfour became very close to Wiseman, and there's many stories about how non-Jews are captivated by the righteousness and the legitimacy and the justice associated with the Jewish claims, and they embark upon things for that reason. But I have many Jewish friends, some of them are in this room, who have been working very hard to make sure that these truths are disseminated and proclaimed all over the place. I think...
Thank you, everyone. I want to end just with two final thoughts. One of actually is when we bring our students to Israel, we go to a place, an Arab village in northern Israel called Barta'ah. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Barta'ah. It's a small Arab village, and it's interesting that it straddles Israel and the Green Line. And one of the reasons we go there is to show students the sort of the arbitrary nature of the Green Line. And as Dr. Gauthier said, this is not a border. It's not the 1967 border. It's the the 1949 armistice line where people stopped fighting. And I think that when you can go there and see that it splits an Arab village in half, we can truly see the arbitrary nature. And I think when we can see that that's not the basis for international law, but often the basis for perceived injustice, then it goes a long way. And I think that the message and the incumbent upon us tonight is to take and disseminate what we've learned. And it's interesting that in the Talmud there's the laws of lost objects and Bava Metzia. And it's very interesting that when there's an object, according to Jewish law, that is lost, and there are two parties, and each party claims that it's 100% his. John says it's 100% his, and Bob says it's 100% his. What does the court do? They split it in half. But what's interesting, what if one party says it's 100% his, but the other party says, well, it's 50% mine and 50% his. What's the area of difference? It's only 50%. So 75% goes to the guy claiming 100%, and 25% goes to the other. And I think that the analogy here is as follows. How can we possibly expect the world to buy our claims for Israel when our opponents are saying, it's ours, the Jews are occupiers, they have no rights to be here, and we say, maybe they're half right. And I think that the message for us is to stop being apologetic, to be full-throated, and to understand the legal rights that are before us. So thank you very much again, everyone, and please check out the information at the back. Thank you.